Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a two-step process, modeling as well as rendering. And we're going to do this by collaborating with another channel, TakeRefuge3D. So in this video, we're going to be going over the basic modeling approaches, the different ways that you can model something like this Super Mario block. And what Peter's going to do at Take Refuge 3D is then take the model and walk through the sort of setup and the process to do materials, appearances, lights, cameras, and the rendering process in Blender. So this is something that I've been asked quite a lot, and I have a Blender series on this channel, even doing some basic rendering, but that's just not really what I focus on. I don't consider myself an expert in that area. So it's a great opportunity to understand and know your limits and be able to sort of pass this on to somebody else that has that experience and that knowledge. So hopefully in this series, you'll get a sort of a sense of how to model something like this. And Peter will take over and talk about UV unwrapping and doing appearances and lighting and all those different aspects to do some really nice renders of this block. So with all of that said, what we're going to be covering is going to be a couple of different approaches that you can take to something like this. We're going to kind of work through and understand basics on curves, which we've done a video on curves. We'll talk about things like imprinting versus using ISO param versus doing this with just 3D objects. So we'll cover a couple of different workflows. You can decide which one is best for you. And at the end, we'll have this object. And again, we're going to send it over to Peter and he'll take care of the rendering portion of it. So to get started, we want to make sure that we start a new file. And this is going to be a basic block that we're going to select and delete, get rid of it, / to zoom in. Now, units are going to be important. So I want to make sure that we go to our preferences, we go to our grid and units, and we set this up to be in millimeters. Now, if you want to make a massive block, so you can have it to be just this insane size, you can use centimeters or meters, whatever you want. But in this video, if you want to follow along with my dimensions, then make sure that you set your units up to millimeters. Grid size of 250 will be plenty fine. Accent lines every 25. All the rest of the settings, don't worry about. But for now, let's jump in and talk about the first basic approach that you could use to create something like this. So we're going to go down and start with our primitives, a center box. You're going to have to hold down the left mouse button, pick the center option here. And this allows us to start at the origin and begin dragging this out. I'm going to hit tab and I'm going to use 50 millimeters, hit tab again, 50 millimeters, hit enter, and then type in 50 one more time. So essentially what we're doing here is we're making just a 50 by 50 by 50 cube and hit enter twice to accept that. So the basic approach that we have here is to make a block. And now we could take this block, which honestly, this is going to be an extremely silly example, but we could take this block and send it to Blender and then apply an appearance. So sort of a texture with a bump map that could represent a block that has this sort of brick texture to it. If you're working on something like a very low polygon model where it's maybe a game asset and memory is a really big issue or constraint, doing this with appearances is going to be 100% valid option. That's not why we're here, because obviously in a case like that, you would just stay in Blender. You'd start with the default cube, slap some appearance on it, and call it a day. What we're going to do is talk more about the different ways in which we can actually create the 3D geometry for that model. So we're going to continue to use this cube. The second thing that we want to understand is the ability to draw lines as a knife tool as well as imprinting. So we're going to go to a front view, and this is going to be our XZ plane. So we're going to double click on XZ here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that we're closer in, and I'm going to start my line tool. In the bottom right, we have two options, knife and undo. With the knife tool, we're going to hit K on the keyboard, and then we're just going to pick a spot on this and begin dragging it out to the right click, and accept. And notice that nothing happened. The reason that nothing happened when we're using the knife tool is because this is actually drawing on the XZ plane. Even though we snapped and clicked onto this object, when we're working in a plane like this, it's going to snap to that plane. So if you are planning on using something like the knife tool, then make sure that we're working in 3D. You can see that it actually did cut the top because that's the segment where we were actually on that plane. So once again, the line tool, K for knife, and then we can start on one edge, go to the other, right click, and now you can see we've divided that object up. So I personally don't think that this is a great option for this type of model, but it is a valid option for all sorts of things, especially if you want to, say, use the knife tool, and I'm going to hit K one more time, and we're going to sort of draw, a section of the block here, and then we could pull this out. Again, 100% valid workflow in a way that we can make a model like this, but again, for our cases, I don't think it's the best option. For the second option, what we're going to do is we're going to go to a side plane. Now, this is going to be our YZ plane, so I'm going to double click here, kind of bring this down, and then I'm going to just draw a line. This one's going to go all the way through my object. Then I'm going to rotate this around and cancel the XZ plane. So this line is going to be used as an imprint. Now, if you don't know the shortcut keys, that's okay. We're going to use F on the keyboard and we're going to find them. But imprint is Shift and I. So when we use Shift and I, we need to select our target body. And notice that it's creating this essentially a slice through the solid body, but only on the faces. So we're going to right click to accept, and I'm going to delete this line. So what this has allowed us to do is create this edge, which then we could use offset. So again, shortcut keys can be hard to remember. You can click on it down here. You can hit O for offset, or you can hit F to find and start to type in offset. And once we have that, we can start to drag this out. And then we've got this section that we can pull in to make a little recess between the bricks. So again, probably not the most ideal workflow, but it is certainly possible. There is another sort of way that we can do this, and that's with a tool called param. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to the bottom. This is going to be a little bit easier to see on the bottom. And let me hide my axes. That way we can see the bottom a little bit. And actually, let me turn off X-ray as well. So we're going to go so we can kind of see the bottom here. All right. So now with param, we're going to use a shortcut key Control and R. You can also, again, search for this, but this is one that honestly isn't going to make a bunch of sense unless you've used it before in something like Blender. So param is a tool that allows us to create these divisions. The benefit here is we can hold down the Shift key and use our mouse wheel and add more divisions. I'm going to right click to accept. The reason this is important is because now what we can do is we can select offset, begin dragging this out, hit Tab to lock the distances, right click to accept. Then from here, I can select the inside line, hit delete to clear it out, and now I've made that sort of recess here. The benefit to this method is it's very easy for us to get a sort of an even division of lines on the face of an object. So I'm going to do this again up here. Again, it's going to be Control and R for param. Now, in this case, if you hit Tab, it'll change its direction. And again, if you hold down Shift, it'll allow you to just add as many lines as you want. Right click to accept. So now, again, we can select multiple areas, we can pull them out or press them in, and this would allow us to go through the process of creating these divisions to create this brick. So once again, I don't think that this is the ideal workflow for us, but it is certainly a valid option. It's something that you can use to start to create this. While all of these are okay ways to do an object like this, we have to remember that with a Mario block or something like this, the bricks are divided around the object, and it makes it so that we really can't do a consistent line all the way around the object. While it does work on the sort of the front face as we start to go vertical, this process would just become extremely cumbersome, becomes hard to do. So for our purposes, I think probably the easiest way is to build out each individual block and move them into their correct position. It may take a little bit of time, but it's a great way for us to learn how to create these objects, how to manipulate them, and ultimately how to build our 3D model. So I'm going to select this object and hit delete. I'm going to bring back my coordinate system. That way we can see the sketch plane or the default top plane. And we're going to once again start with a center box. In this case, what I want to do is hit Tab, and I'm going to make this again 50 by 50, and hit Enter, and then start to pull it up, and I want to make this 50 millimeters. So I can type in 50 and hit Enter, then / to zoom to fit. So now we've got our 50 by 50 block. With the brick, however, we generally want to work about the origin so that we can mirror things as easily as possible. So with this selected, I'm going to use Move. I'm going to move in the Z direction. I know that this is a 50 millimeter block, so I'm going to move down 25 millimeters and hit Enter twice. And once again, / so that we can fit it to screen. So now with this block, I also prefer to work in perspective, which is numpad 5. I just think it looks a bit better, and we're not really constrained as much in this case because we can work in 3D a little bit more than we can when we're dealing with curves. So in this case, I'm going to use this to my advantage, and I'm going to start to build out the different segments of this block. It can be a very good idea for you to find a reference image. I'll just search for Mario block online, find either a 2D or a 3D one, and then you can go to import append, and you can find that block. Now in this case, I've got one called Mario block. I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. So S and S. So basically anytime we use a key like S, G, or R, if we tap it a second time, so G and G, it's going to essentially just link it to the cursor. So you can just start moving it. I'm going to hit R to rotate this about, in this case, the X axis and 90 degrees. And now I've got my reference in here. Another thing we can do is hit M for material, turn on the opacity, which allows us to kind of see through the block. And this gives us kind of a good reference. So you can see we've got some blocks in the corners here. The top, these two go across. On the side, there's a smaller one in the middle. And in the middle section, we've got a sort of a smaller one in the middle here, and they go all the way across there. So there is some repetition to the way in which this is laid out, but this gives us a good sort of foundation understanding what this looks like. If you need to rotate it any more, so for example, rotate it about Z 90 degrees, that way we can see it easier in this view, then go ahead and do that. If you want to have a reference in your model. If you don't need to have it. You can have it on a second screen as well. But for our purposes, it can be easier for us to be able to see it on the screen. So now that we've got this reference, we need to start building this out so we can understand where all the divisions are. And this is where a tool like isoparam comes in handy, even if we're not planning on dividing our sort of block up in that traditional sense. So I'm going to use Control and R for isoparam. I'm going to snap to the center, hold down Shift, and make 2 divisions, and then right-click to accept. From here, I want to select a line, hit O for offset, Tab, and then left-click, and I want to set this to 1 millimeter. And do the same thing down here, hit O, Tab, left-click, and set this to 1 millimeter. Now, the reason for this is because now I can go in and delete the original one. You can use X or delete on your keyboard. And this is going to be my division for the 3 sections. So we've got top, middle, and bottom. We're going to stick with this sort of 50 by 50 cube as our main size, and then we're going to scale the 50 by 50 cube down. And because everything's based around the origin, all we have to do is scale it down universally, which will allow us to have sort of that smaller section right in the middle to hold everything together. So now that we've added these isoparams, I can go to this sort of front view, which is YZ. You can see that it's actually looking at the back side just based on the way that the YZ plane is. That's okay. We can hold down Control and 3, and that will flip it around to our left view. So 3 on the numpad will be the right view, Control and 3 will be the left view. So now that we've got this sort of orientation here, in the center, we're going to be divided right in the middle. So this is once again where isoparam comes in handy. Control R, then Tab, and just simply snap it there. Once again, we can use offset, so O, Tab, and set this at 1 millimeter, and then delete the original. Now you might be saying to yourself, this seems like we're going through the exact same process that you said was too cumbersome. It's too much work to go through this and make all of these different blocks and sort of imprint or offset things. And yes, 100%. But what we're doing here is we're building out our first set of blocks, and then we're just going to copy them from there. So it's important that we get our sense of scale, our sense of size, and from there, we can begin building out the rest of the blocks. So the way that we can do this, and I'll just start with these ones here, is I can select this, and instead of offsetting the face, which will keep it joined together, what we actually want to do is extrude it. Now you can hit E on the keyboard, or you can select extrude here. I'm going to pull this in a specific distance. I don't know exactly how far, but looking at my image here, we can see how far back that brick goes. It looks to be about 10 millimeters just based on visual, sort of my visual reference. But I want this to be a new body. So down in the bottom right, what we can do is we can hit B on the keyboard, right click to accept. So now if I hide the original, I've got one block, this one section here. And based on the way that this was done, that one block could now be mirrored to the other side across X. And now I've got those sort of two blocks in that position here. Okay, so this is the direction that we're taking. And this is why I'm using things like ISO param to break it up. From here, what we could do is we could simply use this block and position it in multiple locations and rescale it so that it works for us. So I'm going to bring back the original. At this point, though, however, I want to go to this original main block. I'm going to hit M for material, and this allows me to play around with the opacity of it and right-click and accept. So now I can see inside of it. There are also things that we can do. For example, we can make it so it's locked and we can't select it. However, we actually do need to select it. So what we're going to do is we're going to make our selections just sort of based on clicking up here in the outliner, or we can just try to click things by hovering over certain portions of them inside of the modeling area. So what we're going to do, again, we're going to select this extrude. Now we are going to build out the next section. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this. We've got duplicate down here as a default option, Shift D. And when I move this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my pivot point, or I'm going to use the freestyle option. So there are a couple ways that we can actually do this. Moving the pivot point to the corner will allow us to have a reference for where this needs to go. Using freestyle will let us select this upper left corner and snap it to this upper left corner. But we can also tap Z, so we're only moving in the Z direction. And then we can hold down Control and have it snap to another location. Now, the downside to that is that it's going to snap to a location based on where the pivot point is. So we really do need to do V for our pivot point and place it in a corner if we want to use this option. Note that now vertical is Y, so we need to hit Y, hold down Control, and let it snap to that top section. I'll right-click to accept, and now I've got a duplicate in that other position. Looking at our reference image here, however, we can see that this duplicate is likely going to be in the wrong orientation. In the middle, it was fine, it wrapped around the edge, but at the top, this block actually needs to go the other direction. It's sort of rotated around. So we can either move it and rotate it into position, or we can scale it until it's right. In this case, what I'm going to do is move it. So I'm going to be using Move, which is G on the keyboard. I'm going to reset my pivot point with V to this position here. Or I can do Freestyle. Let's do Freestyle for this example. F for Freestyle. So we're going to move from that point to this corner and right-click to accept. Next, we're going to rotate it. Once again, we want to reset our pivot point. So V to reset our pivot point, just somewhere on this edge here. And now we can rotate it about Z, 90 degrees. So manually enter 90 and hit OK. So you can see now we've placed that block in that second orientation. And this first block, this is fine. We're going to mirror that across. The second block is fine. We're going to mirror that across as well. And then we need to build one in between them. So the benefit here also is that this block is going to be the same one that's down here. So we can use mirror about Y and right click to accept. So hopefully you can start to see that we're building this pattern out. And at some point in time, you can mirror things across either X, Y, or Z, or you can start to do things like a radial array. Now, I personally find as you're learning, radial array is probably one of the most complicated types of patterning. So I prefer, at least getting started, to teach people to build out these primitive shapes, use things like move and rotate, and also mirroring them across a defined plane, like the XY plane, the XZ plane, or something like that. So just for some visual reference, let's go ahead and shift select the other extrude there, and we're going to mirror them across X and right click to accept. So what we should have at this point, if we hide the original sort of transparent block, is we should have that 2 millimeter gap here between, and we should also have a 2 millimeter gap here, but you can see that it actually looks to be quite a bit bigger. That gap is likely not going to be the right size. So visually, what we need to do is we need to fix this gap. So what I'm going to do is delete all of these other ones that we mirrored. This one doesn't really matter, but I'm going to get rid of it as well. And now I want to make sure that I have that same 2 millimeter gap here. In order to do this, we need to think about a couple of things. We need to first think about this original block and how we divided it up, and we can see where that 2 millimeter gap is. So this block is not going to be the correct height. And what this means is that if we are to extend this one down, looks to be about 1 millimeter, it's going to be taller than this block. For what our purposes, it's probably not a big deal. But if you are trying to keep things relatively the same, for example, if you're trying to work within the confines of these sizes, then we may want to just move the entire block down 1 millimeter, or we may want to scale it up 0.5 millimeter and then scale this one up 0.5 millimeter as well. Whichever option you choose is going to be perfectly fine, but just make sure that it fits with your purposes. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to take this entire block and I'm going to move it G, Z, minus 1 millimeter and hit enter twice to accept. So now we should see that it matches that gap perfectly. And really what this comes down to is that the size of these blocks doesn't perfectly represent that 50 millimeter height. Things are just a little bit off. And again, doesn't really matter. We're making a brick for Mario, but it's going to get smashed anyways, right? So let's hide this original box again, and I'm going to mirror this vertically on Z, shift select this, mirror them across Y. And now what we should see here is that we've got the same gap between these two blocks in the middle and the same gap that we have here. So just something that we want to identify at this point in time. The next thing that we need is a single block between these two. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to duplicate this one. So Shift D or select duplicate. I'm going to right click to leave it where it is. Then I'm going to rotate it. Again, we want to use the pivot point option, which is V on the keyboard. We'll select here and we're going to rotate it about Z 90 degrees and hit enter. Now this is a tricky one here because as we're looking at this, it's going to be tough for us to figure out exactly how much it needs to move and whether or not it's even going to be the right size. So what I'm going to do is actually a little bit of a trick. I'm going to take this face and I'm going to begin pulling it, holding down Control and snap it to this edge here. Right click to accept. And then while it's still selected, I'm going to pull it back. In this case, we can either do minus 2 millimeters to preserve that gap, but because this face is going to be harder to select, in reality, I might do minus 4 millimeters, hit enter twice, and then select the entire block and move it. So G, Y, minus 2 millimeters and hit enter twice. Now, you're going to find that as you begin to work in plasticity, you'll come up with your own habits, things that you prefer to do. There's no history here, so it's just going to be the undo if you make a mistake or deleting and rebuilding an object. So if you decide to, say, move an object rather than offset a face, as long as it's fine in your workflow, that's really all that matters. So everything's working out okay so far. Again, basic brick, we're going to take this one, we're going to mirror it down here, right click to accept. At this point, we've essentially built the front portion of this. So if we take all of these blocks and mirror them across X, you can see the only thing that we're really missing is this brick in this position and then something in the top to fill it in. Now, of course, it doesn't perfectly match the way that the 3D reference I found is, or really the image of a 3D reference, because they've got these little small bricks here and then one in the middle. But honestly, I think that keeping these at the same size makes it quite a bit easier. So for our purposes, we're going to keep them the same size. So what I want to do is I'm going to create a duplicate of this, but I want to rotate it into this position. Now, because we've got all of the references, we could do this many different ways, but I'm going to take this object, I'm going to duplicate it, right click to accept, and then I'm going to rotate it, but I want my pivot point to be in the center here. So V for pivot point and reset it to my origin. And then I can rotate this about the origin, once again, 90 degrees, hit enter, enter again. Now at this point, it needs to move down. So we're going to say G, Z, and as we begin moving it down, you can see that it looks roughly right, but we really don't know. So what we're going to do is rotate this around a little bit, reset our pivot point. So once again, V. I'm going to put the pivot point on the top. Now what I'm going to do is move it in Y. So click Y on the keyboard so it's toggled to Y. Hold down the control key and then just snap to a reference. All right, so let's go ahead and just make sure we understand that. I'm going to rotate this around. V to set my pivot point, slap it on the top of this here. So now in this case, Z is pointing up, so we're going to move it in Z, hold down control, and just snap to another reference. So what this allows us to do is ensure that this block is the same height as this one. So everything's looking okay. We can mirror it across Y in this case, right click to accept. Now the only thing we have left is that same block on the top. Now the space on the top is actually a little bit bigger than it is anywhere else. So this could get a little tricky. And what I would suggest here is that we just create a block that fills in that area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to duplicate it. This time I'm going to view this completely from the top. And with that box selected, let's go ahead and move it. So I'm going to move it to a position. Actually, let's go ahead and move it to the center. So let's rotate this around. And as we begin moving it, click X, hold down Control, snap, and it'll snap it to that origin position. The block itself is pretty tall. It's okay, I don't really care in this instance, but I'm going to right click to accept. The next thing I'm going to do is take this face here, begin pulling it out, hold down Control, snap to that position, right click to accept, and then pull it back -2 millimeters. Hit enter 3 times to accept. I'm going to rotate around and do the same thing over here. So pull this out, hold down Control, snap to our reference, right click to accept, and then pull it back -2 millimeters. So again, not identical to a traditional Mario brick, but hopefully you get the idea or the point on the way in which we can build this out with simple 3D objects. Now we want to take this one, make sure that we're selecting the body, not a face, mirror it about Z. Again, working about the origin is going to give us a lot of ability to mirror and pattern things about that origin, use it as a move reference. And this is something I always suggest. Make sure that you are using those references. I'm going to hide my image, don't really need to see it anymore, but I do need to do a couple of other things here. So I'm going to change my selection filter to Edge, box select everything. We're going to do a fillet, so we're going to hit B on the keyboard, but we want to change this fillet to a chamfer. So we're going to hit C on the keyboard, which will allow us to manually build out a chamfer. Now, if you're going to be entering values into these boxes, they need to be negative for a chamfer, so -1, tab -1, and that should give us a 1 millimeter chamfer on all the edges of our bricks. So right click to accept, and then go back to our all selection, which is 5. So the last thing that we need to do is combine this together with some sort of brick or block in the middle, and that is going to allow us to basically keep this as one whole object. Now I found, because we just added a 1 millimeter chamfer here on the edge, that probably offsetting this 2 millimeters is going to be ideal. So we're going to start by taking this top face, begin pulling it down, hold down Control so it snaps to our reference edges here. And you can see that's a distance of -1. So I'm going to enter -3 and hit enter twice to accept. We need to do the same thing on the other faces. So this outside face here, for example, but you'll notice because this has been divided up, it's going to want to move just this one face. So if this happens, you may find that you want to go through, find those original edges that we created and delete them by selecting them, or you can select the entire face and make it a little bit easier on yourself. But I'm going to go through and just select these edges and get rid of them. Now we'll take this face. It looks like it matches the outside, so all we really need to do is go in -2 millimeters. Note that you can also scale this down. The only reason I'm not scaling it down is because we know that it was taller than it was wide. So in this case, doing these manual face adjustments is likely going to be easier. You do have the ability to offset both sides at the same time. So for example, if I were to select this left face as well as the right face and we used offset, it would pull them both in the same amount. So that does speed things up a little bit. In this case, I'm just doing it all manually, and it's not really that bad. It gives me a little bit of time to just talk about the process. So this face, again, -2. And the last one on the bottom, when I've made bricks like this, I've actually designed some a couple of objects that are like little storage containers with the top that threads off. A lot of times I leave the bottom flat because I'm 3D printing them. In this case, we're going to go ahead and offset it that -3 mm and make it sort of true to life. All right, the last thing that we want to do is combine everything together. So select the original box, select Boolean, and then box select everything else. And then you want to hit Q for union, right click to accept. Now you can see everything is one solid brick. You can see all the intersections because it still has that opacity. So we can select it, hit M on the keyboard and reset opacity to 1. Hit enter twice. We'll come up here and just take a look. I'm going to turn off my toggle overlays so that way we can just see the brick. And once again, it's not a perfect representation of the Mario brick. There are some variations. Obviously, if we just look at it in 2D, say from a front or side view, it looks perfectly fine. If you start to rotate it around and you think about the way that these bricks are built in 3D, you might find that this top brick or block might go back a bit further. This one in the center may be smaller. It really just depends on how you want to build your own. I think for our purposes that this is perfectly fine. Just make sure that everything is okay. And now we want to save it and send it off to Peter so he can do his magic in Blender and start to talk about the process of doing texturing and appearances and what you may want to do from here. And also remember that both our channel, Learn Everything About Design, and Peter's channel, Take Refuge 3D, we are both Plasticity affiliates. Since we're doing a collaboration video, and if you are looking to purchase Plasticity, just think about that if you want to support one of our channels. Our code is LEAD10, and Peter will obviously give you his code as well. So hopefully you carry on and go to Take Refuge 3D, where you can see part 2 of this video if you want to learn about the rendering process and setting that up in Blender. And Peter will walk you through all that. But for now, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.